Committee.
I don't think we've received any apologies. Mervyn may be late. He was away with the Education Committee this morning. But I don't think there's any other apologies. No. Okay, declaration of interest. And as always, if any members have any issues to declare, please do so now. If not, we'll move on to agenda item 3, which is draft minutes of the meeting held on the 30th of April. Refer members to tab 1, which is page 6 of your packs. And if you're happy enough to agree those, I'll sign them. Great. Okay, then agenda item 4 is matters arising. Any matters arising for the minutes of the 30th of April? No. Okay, we'll move on to agenda item 5, which is review of the Code of Conduct. And we're getting a briefing from the Committee on Standards in Public Life. As those of us who were at the lunch will know, it will just be Lord Bew. Members, if you go to the clerk's paper at page 11 and the briefing paper from the Committee on Standards in Public Life at page 18 and our own committee issues paper at page 24, you'll recall that the Committee on Standards in Public Life is an independent advisory body of the Government which monitors, reports and makes recommendations on all issues relating to standards in public life. Lord Bew is the chair of that committee and is here to give evidence today.
Okay.
Lord Bew, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much.
We understand you'll be flying solo today, so if you maybe wanted to just introduce yourself for the record, and then maybe talk to the evidence that you've given us, and we'll facilitate questions, if that's okay.
Right. I have a brief opening statement. First of all, I'd just like to thank you all. I'm very grateful for the chance to be here. Ruth Thompson, who is the head of the office in Committee on Standards of Public Life in London, through some navigational error, is in Shannon Airport, not Belfast Airport. So I am without the support of the most efficient person I've ever met in my life, and who has been working on this. But anyway, I think it's better we go ahead and don't cancel or rearrange the meeting, because you're all very busy people. And as I say, I'm grateful for the chance to be here, albeit alone. And one reason why I'm grateful is that the triennial review, which governs the work of the Committee for Standards in Public Life in 2012, before my appointment, reviewed a whole number of things, significantly reduced our budget. That review also suggested, well, stated, and the Government did accept the recommendation, that the committee should not inquire into matter related to devolved legislatures, that's not just here obviously, but Scotland and Wales, except with the agreement of those bodies. And everything that I say today is within that spirit, that there are certain things that it might be useful for you to discuss with me today, but fundamentally these decisions are yours, and your Commissioner's role is not the same as my role. I will come across that, and I'll try and explain why it's not the same as my role, even in the sense of the, it's not the Belfast variant of the London role. It's a different sort of role, as indeed your Commissioner's made clear. He has a different role from Scotland as well. Now, the objective of the Committee of Standards in Public Life in London is to maintain an overview of ethical issues across public life. And the committee's first report famously set out 3 common threads to ensure that the 7 principles of public life were properly understood and integral to the conduct of individuals in public life and the culture of public sector organisations. Codes of conduct, independent scrutiny and guidance and education. And I should obviously explain just briefly that the 7 principles known as the Nolan Principles of Public Life: selflessness, objectivity, openness, honesty, accountability, integrity, leadership. Those are the 7 principles. We'll come back to the descriptors later on how we have actually refined these descriptors. And there is a debate, and it does come up in our response to your document, about this particular point about the descriptors. But that's where we are. We do consider it's good practice to review code of conduct regularly, as you're clearly doing, in order to learn the lessons from administering the code, and also things change in the light of changing expectations and standards. And my committee welcomes very much the extent to which the document we have seen draws from the recommendations made in our report, Standards Matter, and your emphasis on providing both aspirational principles and enforceable rules. Now, Standards Matter was produced in January 2013, the last major document of the previous chairman, Sir Chris Kelly. And the subtitle is A Review of Best Practice in Promoting Good Behaviour in Public Life. I'll probably be making some references to it. But it has, although the work of the previous chairman, been a very significant guidance to me and the sort of things that we are trying to do at the present moment in the Committee of Standards of Public Life in London. I've changed some things or have a different emphasis on some points, but there are lots of points that are in here which I've tried to follow very faithfully. Now, our response was confined to issues of principle and areas of recent changes in standards or expectation, as we consider practical issues beyond the clarity about the clarity of guidance are obviously best resolved on the basis of the Northern Ireland Assembly Commission for Standards and Committee for Standards and Committee on Standards. In other words, some of these practical issues we do not consider it valuable for us to intervene. It's your key problem. But there is one issue of principle I would like to emphasise, if I may, and that is that the 7 principles of public life, which are widely recognised and provide a common set of standards for those who serve the public. Now, as such, we would have reservations about amending the actual descriptors of the principles. Standards Matter offers some new descriptors. Although, of course, we have absolutely no difficulty with you adding additional principles or elaborating in guidance how they apply to members. We have absolutely no difficulty with that. And I'd just better explain what I mean by that. I actually think this was our most revised attempt, January 2013, to give you descriptors of what these things like selflessness, objectivity, honesty, integrity, accountability, openness, and so on, what is meant by them. I actually don't want to sound dogmatic. I'm already privately, or private not the right word, I'm already open to the view that these descriptors could be modified. I mean, to take one particular thing on integrity, and this is more specifically a problem that's very visible in Westminster in the last year, where the emphasis is on decisions that particularly a minister might take and on the undue influence of money leading him to take such a decision. Now, one of the things that you've seen is in the last year in and around Westminster is what's at stake is not quite so much a decision as such, you know, HS2 or not or whatever, government's position on AstraZeneca or whatever. It's not so much that, it's about one of the things that the lobbying crisis has revealed in the last year is there's an element of what you might call selling of, or what might be said to look like the selling of advocacy futures. You might even say fantasy futures. But the selling of advocacy rights. In other words, it's not a question of a minister being lobbied and the minister saying, bung me 10,000, I'll do that for you. It's people are actually, or some of these cases appear to involve issues where particularly foreign governments want advocacy of some sort in Westminster, want a platform of some sort in Westminster. There's no decision here at all. It's advocacy rights, essentially. Now, I still think it's fundamentally important for Parliament to defend its integrity. If the Parliament of the United Kingdom has a certain standing in the world, and therefore the idea that you can actually influence all party groups, for example, and how they, through the application of money in a serious way, I think is a problem. So what I'm trying to say to you is I'm not actually completely convinced that the descriptors shouldn't be modified to actually take the discussion of integrity or to broaden it away from just decisions that in effect that a minister might make, but to advocacy, this more broader issue of advocacy rights, which seem to be part of the problem in the last year. So I am not saying to you, in some fanatical, fundamentalist way, these 7 descriptors that we're offering or that we committed ourselves to 18 months ago will never be changed. What I am saying is, for the time being, they are widely recognised by the public. It's pretty clear what they mean. There's room for debate, and over time we might move forward and, modify these descriptors again in another document like this matter. And there is another issue about whether delivery ought to be a Nolan principle, actual delivery. In other words, what I'm saying to you is, at the moment, I think, as a practical matter, we have these 7 principles. They're pretty well understood. It's like the 10 Commandments. And, while we can have a debate about it in the future and we want to be flexible, we've always got to be keeping them constantly reviewing. At the moment, we think it's wisest to keep it in the framework of the existing descriptors. And it's not because I have some ideologically intense commitment to it or I'm inflexible about what the future might develop. At the moment, that's our view as a committee. Now, on lobbying, which is at least partly a problem for you, or at least partly an issue for you, I'm not so clear how deep the problem is here. We published our report on strengthening transparency around lobbying in November 2013, and we issued a call for evidence. Lobbying industry, charities, campaign bodies, academics and think tanks. We had a particularly valuable seminar in London with members of the press there as well. And it's obviously a major issue in London. The Prime Minister has said that abuse of lobbying has contributed to a lack of trust and confidence in political decision-making. And our report applied to Nolan principles to lobbying and concluded that more needed to be done to guarantee more openness, transparency around lobbying and provide greater clarity on the standards expected of public office holders. Now, and it made certain measures it suggested for enhancing transparency. Let me say here straight away that we are well aware of the fact that decades of work, going back 2 decades with our own committee and so on, of enhancing transparency in various areas, has not had a magical effect on public trust. And we are well aware of the fact that, and I just say this, there's some value, that it's perfectly obvious that a great labour has gone on in British public life to expand transparency. And, for example, on the question of political donors, the United Kingdom, I was at the OECD seminar in last autumn. The United Kingdom is the best, right at the top of 47 OECD countries, with, by the way, one problem area, which is where we now are, because of the rules for political donations are here, and foreign donations on disclosure is not the same as it is in the rest of the United Kingdom. But leaving out that, and even with that, the UK is at the top for transparency of party political donations. I suspect if we polled the British public next week and said, what do you think about the transparency levels of party political donations, you get pretty dim and dusty figures. Transparency hasn't magically increased trust, whatever trust actually is, and that's in itself an interesting concept. But it is unavoidable. We do take the view that you're not going to get or to be able to defend the public life of the country without transparency. We just now know that if Lord Nolan thought 20 years ago, all I need to do is to implement measures of transparency and the public will stop being so cynical about politicians, anybody who thought that would clearly be wrong. The simple fact, it doesn't mean there's any alternative, and there's certainly no question. We recommended a number of issues to enhance transparency in and around the lobbying area. And as regards Parliament, we also raised a special concern about the issues that relate to chairmen of select committees, because one of the great changes in Parliament in the last few years has been the emergence of chairmen of select committees, as certainly far better known than most junior ministers. They're elected by the whole House. They have a standing, whether it's Bernard Jenkin or the chairman of PASC, to whom I have a particular responsibility to, and I've had one hearing with another one shortly. They're elected by all the members across the House. The new Defence Committee will now have a new chairman. There's a lot of media attention to that. The role of Margaret Hodges' Public Accounts Committee, again, is something we've been involved in. All these people are now have a significance in the public life in the country and a significance in Parliament, which they didn't have when we were first drawing up documents 20 years ago. And we have suggested that you have to look closely at their relationship to lobbyists. So that's something that at the moment, the House Committee is looking at. Sir Kevin Barron's committee on standards has taken up as a consequence of our report, and they're looking around the question of committee chairs and what is to be done. The other major thing that's actually happened, pleasantly to my surprise, is the House of Lords have essentially accepted our recommendations for the House of Lords. And it's obviously essential. Everybody knows that, glance at the newspapers to realise that the problems that Parliament has had, to put it no higher than this, have not been just elected members. Right? To put it no higher than that, there have been cases and issues which affected the House of Lords, and the House of Lords has just basically accepted our document on lobbying. But I just want to say this one thing. We do say at the beginning of our document on lobbying is part of the healthy lifeblood of any democracy. And it is simply a question of ensuring the maximum transparency. Without it, we would not be as well informed as we are. I would not be in. Let's take a simple example of medical and health matters that come up in the House of Lords without the various lobby groups in that field contacting me and so on. And there's a perfectly legitimate role as part of the democratic life of a country for lobbying groups. And it's not just a legitimate, it actually enhances our democracy. It's just a question of ensuring that the public does not have reason to believe that that there is an undue weight given to the power of money behind the scenes. And the public is strongly inclined to believe this in Britain. One of the things we've recently published is what we call our Eurobarometer. So we looked at all European countries, looked at experience of corruption, citizens' actual experience of corruption, and then how corrupt they thought their country was. Now, some European peoples, the Italians, for example, say, not sure we've got a very clean system, and yes, quite a lot of us have had to bribe people at certain times, to get things done. The Dutch and the British have virtually no actual experience of corruption. They can't say I had to bribe anybody or anything like that. Very low. But the Dutch deduce from that their system's pretty clean. The British, a third of them, deduce from that they just don't know about it, but still their system's pretty bad. So we have a particular public mood. And it's actually quite interesting, that Eurobarometer, that gap between the real empirical experience of people and what people actually believe about their country and what's actually going on. So that was one of the pieces of work we've just done. And I just want to refer to a couple of other pieces of work that we've done and then continue. But I just, before doing that, I just wanted to say that you have a long section in your document on member staff, and my committee, as you will be aware, did not consider it as necessary expertise to comment on those sort of questions of detail. However, our committee has stated previously, when considering MP staffing, in our document on MPs' expenses and allowances, which I brought with me, that it is important as a matter of principle and good practice that there should be broad parity of treatment of staff, and a code of practice backed up by appropriate training and HR support for members is one way to achieve that. And since our response was drafted, we note that the House of Lords Conduct and Privileges Committee have issued a report that a new code of conduct for member staff should be introduced, and the proposals include provisions relating to a requirement to abstain from lobbying or using access to Parliament to further outside interests in return for payment or other reward, a requirement to register all employment, any financial interest in businesses or organisations involved in parliamentary lobbying, and any gifts received above £140 in value that arise from their work in Parliament. And breaches of that code could result in the individual's parliamentary pass being removed. Now, I just want to conclude here by just talking about a couple of other areas of our work, and then I want to have a chance to hear your questions. We are currently producing 2 documents. One is about ethics in practice, and it's about the ethical education across the public sector and the grasp of ethical issues across the public sector, not just Parliament. And you realise this is a controversial point as to MPs and their relationship to these broader ethical questions. So that is one document that will publish within about a month. And we are also publishing, and this whole question of ethics in Parliament, but ethics across the public sector in general, is something we felt we've got to have to deal with head on. And the second major point that I want to make is that we are publishing a major document on the new mix of public-private, the way in which many public services now are carried out by private concerns of one sort or another. And we are discussing the ethical world in which that now takes place. So it's this new mixture of public providers and way of providing services to members of the public who often have no alternative. These 2 documents are forthcoming. The reason why I'm saying these 2 things is that I'm anxious that you understand the difference between the role that I have and the role that your Commissioner here, Douglas Bain, has, where he has been asked to look at individual cases. We do not do individual cases. So, for example, the reason why I'm stressing the nature of our work is to point out is focus on these general issues. We do not do individual cases. And I have no expertise to offer with respect to individual cases. When Maria Miller, to take a recent case of drama, happened, it is absolutely true, because the nature of our body with the title of Commissioner for Understanding of Public Life and being quite close to the 2 parliamentary standards bodies who were involved, the title was quite close. The public ran us endlessly, asking what we were doing, why we were not doing it. The answer is nothing. Also, the triennial review to which I referred to earlier specifically says that it is not the role of the chairman to be rushing into TV and radio studios to comment on these cases. Again, this drives the people who run TV and radio studios absolutely mad. Yes, you're the chairman of the Committee on Standards of Public Life. Why aren't you down here to tell me whether Maria Miller should stay in office or resign? This went on incessantly for 10 days. But actually, I took the job on the basis that the rules governed the job, just as I took it on the job on the basis that it was no longer our business to be involved in the work of devolved assemblies without the agreement, consent of the devolved assemblies. I took it on the basis that I was not going to be rushing into television studios in these cases, and there's a very good reason for it. You can actually, and you all might remember some of the alleged cases over the last 18 months, you can get it wrong. Something that looks not so good when it's clarified may not be quite so good, but then you've compromised your office because you've got it wrong. And I said nothing about the case until Maria Miller actually resigned. And then I walked in and did immediately go to the World at One studio to talk about the actual implications in terms of what the values we're supposed to be defending in public life for the case. But I did not talk at any point during that week or 8 or 9 days in which she was in trouble. So the point is, if you expect, it's clear, or at least I can see a media expectation of your Commissioner, Douglas Bain, to respond to individual cases where people have complained about certain things that MLAs have done or said. I can't really offer much advice in that area or refinement. I understand, just from talking to him, how he sees the future developing in what he thinks will be the best possible way. But as far as individual cases are concerned and issues that relate to individual cases, I don't have much to say. In fact, I'm forbidden from, it's more than that, I'm actually effectively forbidden from addressing individual cases in order to preserve the integrity of the office to defend the general principles. I'm more than happy. Sorry to go on, but I felt if I did stick with my opening statement, we wouldn't have the danger which will happen, because Ruth, normally at these meetings, Ruth tells me 5 minutes to the end the things I should have said. So now that I've at least put some things on the record, I will have not forgotten too much, I hope.
Okay. Well, look, we have a number of members have questions to you. Again, I've asked members to keep questions relatively brief, and hopefully we will get answers that are relatively brief as well. And if there is any further documentation you want to provide the committee with afterwards, then we're happy enough to receive that, so that would be good. If I can just ask a question around the issue of principles and rules. In your submission to us, you welcome the emphasis on providing both aspirational principles and enforceable rules, which mutually complement each other. Can you make clear to us what you see as the difference between the aspirational principles and the enforceable rules, and what the relationship should be between them?
So I can understand why the way that you're moving is to actually having a clear-cut set of rules, and I have no problem with that, especially if there's a sense that they lack clarity. And I also realise in the past, so I have no difficulty with with that approach. We have no difficulty with that approach, and I think the principles I think the fundamental thing is to look at any rule that you might adopt and say, is it physically in discordance with the principles? Other than that's what I think the job is. Have we suggested a rule which means that we're not defending honesty here, or we're not defending accountability, or we're not defending integrity? But I think, first of all, you've got a set of very specific circumstances here, and you've a set of type of issues which are not going to appear in the same way throughout the rest of the United Kingdom. I know enough to know that. And therefore, from your point of view, to aim for a clear set of rules and just have the principles there as a backdrop is the way to go, I think.
Okay, so
well understand why I think the drive is on from your end to modernise and clarify. And we have no problem with that at all.
Okay, so you don't necessarily think that every principle should have a corresponding rule. You're happy enough with it?
No, I don't. I can't really see. I mean, I'm the worst fetishizer of the principles of public life, but I think that's for our work. You see, one of the things I think is that sometimes people ask us to engage in issues which are. Let's take one thing we did a lot of work on, which is party political funding. Now, first of all, there is a moral dimension to this. It is related to work at our committee. We've produced a major document on it, which is currently not going to, but put it this way, it's not going to be implemented before the next general election. It's much within the bounds of the debate that it might well be returned to after the general election, although with public opinion so critical in Britain of politicians, it's hard to kind of imagine them paying more for their politics at the moment. But having said that, I've no doubt that that is a really important document which is alive in the sense that everybody knows we have a difficult situation now, and in the short term it's not going to be picked up. It will be part of the debate in future. That's where it sits. And we were asked to do it. I have this slight reservation, which is this, and the Prime Minister asked us to do it, so we're going to do it. And it's not about the quality of what we produced, or as I say, its viability intellectually. It's because actually, what I call old-fashioned trade union donations to the Labour Party, old-fashioned business donations to the Conservative Party, in principle, let's take the easiest one, trade union donations, are not moral questions of 7 principles of public life. You know, I mean, you can say that in practice things have gone wrong, the unions have money in the Labour Party, but in principle it's not a moral question. And so I've already said this, but I have a belief in terms of our own work, and I'd like it in principle, that we don't do things which are kind of morally significant, which this is, unless it's really, and even though I think this is a good document we produce, because basically, you know, I don't see what is morally wrong with, for example, the old-fashioned way the Labour Party funded itself. You may, as I say, have in terms of our principles. Now, you may think lots of things are wrong. You may have political judgment, but in your political philosophy it's wrong. You may think all that about trade union donations and so on. You may have lots of good political arguments. I'm talking about honesty, integrity, accountability. You see what I mean? The moral wrongness of it. I don't see what is, and that we have a system today which, for a variety of reasons, has a taint around it. I accept completely, but I am, as I say, a fundamentalist almost about the 7 principles, and getting our work back to the 7 principles, but it's a general point of view, but to the point where we say that there must be some one-on-one with anything that the Northern Ireland Assembly thinks is a rule, when actually the type of issues that I'm sure you're thinking about, because it will be based on experience of cases that have come before you or be in or around you in the last 2 or 3 years, don't actually fit neatly with the 7 principles. Is fundamentalist though I am of the 7 principles that I've just explained, I'm not that much of a fundamentalist. Okay.
I think you're right in terms of your view where the committee is perhaps heading towards in terms of separating the two out and having a cleaner document. And though we haven't made any final decisions, I think that's probably the view of the committee. On that basis, if we are trying to be a little bit more prescriptive with our rules that we have in our code, do you think that there is value in having a sort of catch-all rule, so a rule about not bringing the house into disrepute or something along those lines? Is there value in that rule, or is it unfair to those individuals because they haven't broken any of the rules above, and this is a sort of, we'll get you in this one then?
Well, to answer that with accuracy, I'd have to have a clear, you'd have to know what you eventually decide on the rules above.
But I suppose that there's no way of always covering every possible scenario in the rules. So therefore, the question is, should there be a...
this is where I suppose there's a value in saying, as a backdrop, in deciding on the specific rules, we have had in our mind also the 7 principles of public life, because the 7 principles of public life presumably would possibly cover a gap in that light, that it doesn't actually, but life is like this, that nobody actually, things happen, which once they happen, everybody says that was wrong, but they didn't think about it the year before. The example, by the way, I've already given an example about that when I talked about how our definition of political integrity is related to money, lobbying, and ministerial decision. But actually what went wrong in the following year after we published this was not related to this at all. It was related to what I call the selling of advocacy rights. And I mean, that's so and everybody says, oh, that's wrong too. But nobody saw when the very able people who drew up this document defined the problem in a way more narrow than it actually turned out to be. So I see a problem that it is almost inevitable in the complex world of politics, Northern Irish politics, that something may emerge which is not covered by your rules. But at least, if it's not covered A, by your rules, and B, by some broad adherence to the principles of public life, then it's a pretty lucky customer, isn't it? If you can't say either you haven't adhered to the principles of public life or you haven't, we've laid out what we want, then.
But I suppose the difficulty comes if you have separated the two out and you're saying that your principles are not rules. Your principles are something that we should all aspire to, and we give a nod in that direction in our code.
Yeah.
But if it's not one of the enforceable rules, then
yeah,
it doesn't.
I get your point. But it's very difficult for me without seeing and you haven't agreed on a final list of rules to see how serious the problem is. And I'd be reluctant to say at this point that I have anything of value to say on the question you're asking me, which is there should be some general rule of letting down the house as well. And because I would have thought your rules would largely be defining various bits of letting down the house, as it were. So I'm sorry, without seeing the final definition of rules, I can't give you a definitive answer.
Sure, that's fair enough. Anna?
If I ask just a couple of short questions?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. I understand what you're saying about us maybe not trying to change the descriptor of the 7 Nolan principles, because it's all understood by the public.
Yeah.
But in your recommendations to us, in your submission to us, you said if we have any additional principles, we should separate it from the 7 principles. So why? Well,
let's suppose, it's not quite, I mentioned one earlier, that is a genuine area of debate in London. We should have delivery. We don't at this point. And I'm not quite sure in this context, but it's an example of a possible other principle that we don't
For
currently
example,
have.
in Northern Ireland, say, good relation is a big thing for us that
Yes.
we should all adhere to.
I'm actually look, when the office is responding, they're responding from a perspective which is very much governed by the work of the CSPL in London. Maybe because I live here and so on, I no longer involved in these matters in around the 70s. Was much more so. I'm relatively relaxed as long as it's clearly, as long as what I really want is, as you're currently doing, and what I'd be very happy with, is if it is flagged up where you stand on the 7 principles, where you then to say, in the context of Northern Ireland, there are certain things in our mind which are of particular importance. Personally, I'm quite relaxed about that and go beyond it.
Okay, okay. Well, in relation to the wording used in codes of conduct, Standard Metro says that wherever possible, a code should be framed positively. Could you explain to us what do you mean by that and how?
Well, this is a Standards Matter represents a moment, 18 years into the life of the Committee on Standards and Public Life, where I think something like 10 or 11 regulatory bodies exist in London. 2 alone, 3, well, 3 alone, for example, regard to the separate one for expenses, the 2 that were involved in dealing with the Maria Miller case, 3 alone, very visible on Westminster alone. I've been told, I haven't counted them all, there's something like 12 bodies set up as a result of recommendations of our committee over the years. And the strong sense is, and the whole tone of the document is, enough already. One reason why I said that the resources of my committee were cut back, now part of the reason is the general Whitehall squeeze on public expenditure, but part of the reason is actually a not unreasonable view on the part of government that you've set up all these other committees and you don't have to do that bit of work anymore because you've set up that committee or the other committee to do it, and that therefore you don't need quite as much a slice of the cake. So we are in a place where there's a certain jadedness of tone about new regulatory institutions. I've been there almost a year now. I have not suggested yet another regulatory institution, and I have no intention. And our whole approach now is not to suggest new rules, new regulations, new institutions to enforce better behaviour. Our whole approach is to try and canvass on first principles across the public sector. And again, this is the difference between my role and your commissioner, because we have a responsibility across the public sector. The first thing that I was most involved in was actually policing. Our whole approach is, in terms of the first document that came out under my chairmanship on police statistics, our whole approach is to talk about the embedding, people getting it in their head, canvassing across, making sure that people in the public sector know this is what you're expected to do and achieve, and not yet more bodies, not even yet more regulations. That's why we're doing the ethics document in the next month, which will be controversial because some of the people it's addressed to do not think they need to be talked to about ethics. They think they already know right from wrong. And by the way, I get it. I know why they think they already know from right to wrong. But I still think we as a committee have a duty to say, actually, there is a need for a stronger ethical trade awareness across the public sector. It actually exists in part of the public sector, and it exists even in part of the private world, and it works quite well. And that's where we are. In other words, that's what that passage is getting at. It's getting at the importance of getting it into people's hearts, and not anymore saying, if you don't do this, by the way, the regulator's going to get you. We've done it enough. There are enough. We are coming down in regulators in London, and we're coming down to systems of rules. This is a little bit. I mean, I know you want to, and I think anyway you're going this way. Clarify. You know, the more simple and straightforward and clear cut they are, the better.
Sandra?
Thanks, Chair. Thanks very much, Lord B. Clarity, as you say, is something that we're seeking. But one of the difficulties we have with a lot of complaints coming to the committee is identifying when a respondent is actually acting in the capacity as an MLA or
I
not.
know.
And as a matter of principle, how do you think we should define that or draw a line between private and public?
Well, I'm open to the argument that the issue, that it's possible that this should be the way out of a difficulty, which I understand the Assembly has, is that if it's something where the public might reasonably perceive that they were acting as an MLA, maybe a way out of this particular problem. In the wording, I'm not quite sure it resolves. I'm aware of the sort of cases that have been in the past where that issue, in principle at any rate, is there, and it may be that's the way out.
Okay.
So it's not just a question of they're acting as an MLA. Many cases, of course, including in some of these controversial, people say, actually, I was acting as MLA, and that's it. You know, I mean. You may not like what I did or said on that occasion, but I was acting as an MLA. But I realised that in the case where a member is not as frank as that, it might be helpful to have the language that says something where it is perceived that they were acting as an MLA. It might be necessary. In the case where somebody says, I don't have anything to discuss here because I was doing this in some private capacity.
So the difficulty comes in at a political event. So if the individual was invited as an MLA or as a political representative,
Yeah.
so they can't necessarily claim it was in a private capacity if they were there at a political event by virtue
No.
of the fact they're a politician, I suppose. And
I do think, yeah, I actually, there are certain things which are a bit different in political culture in London. I don't actually think that the political culture in London quite tolerates this concept of elected persons acting in a private capacity, the way that theoretically, at least, it's alive here. You know, if I can put it like that.
Sandra?
Yes, I'll just follow on. In the Standards Matter report, you say it's important to recognise that there can be circumstances where private behaviour can affect the reputation and
Yes.
integrity of public institutions. Such intrusion should only happen where there's a clear public interest to justify it and should always be proportionate. Under what circumstances do you believe it would be in the public interest to investigate conduct related to the private life of the member?
Well, we drew attention to that because of the substantial part of your document relating to the question of the private, and we took a view and we used that language. I don't want to go. We actually talked quite a lot in the office about how we'd respond to that section of your document. Went back to our text, and the advantage of what we did is, of course, it doesn't discuss individual cases. I'm perfectly well aware of the sort of individual cases that might be in people's minds just at this moment. But I'd like to stand over just the language that's used in Standards Matter. It's this question of, to go beyond it would require me to talk about individual circumstances, or even if I talk about individual situations like naming names, it's rather against, as I say, the rules that govern my job to do that or get into that. So that's why we spent quite a lot of time looking at your section, your report, and there's a reason why we quoted Standards Matter at that point in reply. I'd like to stand over that and not go beyond it, if that's all right.
Well, we did our best to try and draw you in.
Yeah, I know you did. It's fair enough. It's fair enough. Did cause quite a lot of anguish over coffee in the office about 2 weeks ago.
Thank you.
Okay, Paula?
Thank you. Another issue that has arisen for us through this committee is the issue to do with the right to free speech.
Yeah.
And Standard Matters, it recognises that for political office holders, the right to freedom of speech under the European Convention on Human Rights places some restriction on the extent of which some behaviour, which might be otherwise be perceived as inappropriate, can be sanctioned. In your opinion, what would your view be to do with political office holders such as yourselves and why we should be treated differently to others in public life?
Well, the first point is, and I've been much involved in this in Westminster, is that I actually do think that what is said in the chamber should have absolute privilege. Your chamber and the chamber in Parliament. There is a complicated subsequent question as to the reporting of that, and that does not have absolute privilege, and the Privilege Committee, which I was on in Westminster, did not recommend it as absolute privilege. And there is a slight problem, because you can see somebody saying something on the parliamentary channel, and then the press be reluctant to report it because they know they don't have absolute privilege, although they do have the lesser forms of privilege in terms of who won't have to prove malice in what they were doing if they reported a substance. They have qualified privilege if they do, as I understand it. But the first thing to say to you is I actually really that element of the privilege of members, I think it's entirely correct that they do have that right. One of the things that the Hansard Society, we've had a recent debate with Hansard Society on public attitude to the standing of members of Parliament, what they can do and they cannot do, is that the public believes that if you're an elected member, that's a special privilege, and you must be prepared to make certain sacrifices. So, for example, I speak now as a person most likely a university teacher. Now, the university teacher is on the public payroll. Quite a lot of university teachers are paid quite well, probably more than members of Parliament. Quite a lot of them are, well, lots of them are great people and so on, but some are not such great people, don't deliver dramatically. The public does not believe that university teachers, who are, you might say, an equally privileged life, have some special extra tax on them because they went into this job. And the public does believe it about members of Parliament. You may think I'm drawing attention because I'm not convinced it's totally fair, as somebody who's had a relatively comfortable job, if you see what I mean. But that's a fact. The public doesn't believe that university teachers bear a special tax on them because they went into this job. They do believe, the university teachers, no, lots of other quite privileged people in comfortable public sector jobs, not nurses, right? You know, not top-end jobs in the public sector, but they don't believe that senior local government offices, which is probably not the most exhausting, and you know, and so on. They don't. I don't know, but they don't believe that public sector employees in general, some of whom would look to be reasonably well paid and have reasonably comfortable lives, they have an extra tax to pay because they're elected, right? That they know more. They do believe it. The other side of the coin, in my view, is if they believe it, then one of the reasons why that might be a viable argument is, and I'm uneasy about that argument for the reason I've given, is because the people who speak in the chamber must have an extra privilege. That is the one, to me, extra privilege, that people who speak, and they have an extra, and nothing should be done to reduce that right. So I actually would go even slightly beyond Standards Matter in tone and what it says about what the public, what members of Parliament say. But it remains the case that outside the chamber, you're in the same position as everybody else. That's the reality, and you have to, and you have the same responsibilities under the law as to what you say and what you don't say. And I defended people's right to say things in the chamber, which I'm sure I would ferociously disagree with. But outside the chamber, and suffer no legal penalty. Outside the chamber, they're in the same position as everybody else under the law.
Okay. Well, okay, Ian.
Okay. I'd like to ask you about sort of bullying and harassment and those type of complaints. I suppose we're always referring to Standards Matters, but it acknowledges that these issues can be particularly complex, and you know, it states that organisations where elected members work alongside employed staff need to have agreed procedures in place establishing who has the authority to investigate and adjudicate on complaints and what sanctions can be applied and by whom. So, obviously the code is one it's an avenue in which complaints can be investigated, but given the formal nature of Commissioner's investigation and the fact that the committee then publishes all its reports, the process isn't always going to be satisfactory. Do you think that, in the first instance, organisations have a responsibility to investigate these sort of complaints in a more informal and sensitive manner before complaints under the Code of Conduct should be considered?
Well, I get the point. I mean, I always have a bias in favour of any, attempts to sort things out in a, what were your words, informal and sensitive way. But I did say in the introduction that we certainly do take a strong view as a committee that, as a matter of principle and good practice, there should be broad parity of treatment of staff. And secondly, I did draw attention to the fact that in the intervening period of time, just in the last few days, the House of Lords has produced in its Conduct and Privileges Committee a new document which relates to issues around members' staff on some of these issues. And I noticed that Paul was noting it there. We'll make sure that you get it. And there's a fair amount of detail there, which it's certainly the most recent document on this issue produced at Westminster. It's actually just within the last week or so that it's actually come out. And I hope that, well, I'm sure you'll look at it, and it may be in some ways be helpful to you. Thank you.
Okay. Cahill?
Thanks, Chair, and thank you very much for your presentation so far. Just a wee bit of clarity on the issue of members' own staff. Do you believe they should have their own code of conduct, or should be accountable to the members themselves?
Well, the implication of the Lord's document, as the new document, is that they should have their own code of conduct. But I mean, I'm not. While I've just recommended said we've just produced a new document, it might be interesting. The truth of the matter is that Lords and their staff is such a different world from here. For example, peers who have staff are paying for that totally out of their own pocket, which I'm guessing that you are nobody around this table is personally doing that. So I mean, and that alone means you're not comparing like with like. So all I'm saying is that we happily pass on this new document, which came into the office just a few days ago, but you can't make deductions about what's going on in one particular House of Parliament, what's appropriate here, and that's all I can reasonably say, because it's just totally different.
And just, Chair, may
Yep.
and you see in relation just to the whole idea of lobbying, and obviously there's a report you have done in terms of strengthening transparency around lobbying. The issue of actually where we meet lobbyists there and suggesting recording meetings and publicising, do you believe that should be mandatory in our rules, our code, or should we just guide the best practice?
I actually think that there is a case for people every 3 months publishing their meetings with lobbyists. That's my personal position on it. And it's based on my experience in London. It's not based on, and I want to say this, on any realistic understanding of, or insight into the situation in this Parliament. But I actually do think that. I think that there is a case for doing. And again, I don't think, as I've been saying before, these greater measures of transparency, I don't think remove public disenchantment. They clearly have not. But I'm equally convinced that without them, you can't get on the right side of.
But are we ever going to really get right? I mean, if the public perception is so bad of politicians, irrespective of the massive strides in terms of increasing accountability and transparency in recent years, is it a realistic expectation that suddenly the public are going to think we're all doing a good job and we're all squeaky clean? how can we ever actually deal with the perception that we have? Surely we have to deal with the reality of it. And if the reality is that there is not a lobbying issue here in Northern Ireland,
That's why I was careful to say that I wasn't. That I wasn't saying what I said on the basis of any sense that to say I've said what I actually believe is right.
but is a lot of the positions that you've adopted not based more on the public perception and attitudes towards,
but
as
look,
opposed to
what you're asking me, Chairman, is at the very heart of everything. That I mean, your commissioner's job, your committee is different from the ones that I've been working. My job in London or the other regulatory bodies that over time Lord Nolan's committee set up. But it's nonetheless, we're all plunged around in this problem, right? That's what you're raising the question about. And I've already indicated to you what I think is the problem. And I should say that the triennial review, which made the changes involving devolved assemblies and other changes I've already referred to, about the chairman not rushing into television studios and so on. The triennial review says that the chairman should not, because of the way public opinion is, should not set himself the target of that 3 or 5 years from now Parliament is gone up in these polls and people's assessment of members of Parliament have gone up. And that's just kind of backbreaking, given the kind of point that you're making, given where public opinion is. So I've accepted the job with the kind of invocation to be modest in what you can achieve in this respect, and don't go racing around the place trying to revolutionise the public opinion as politicians, because it won't work. But let me add something. I accept all that. I accept the gist of what you're saying. There's a couple of things that are worthy of special concern. One is, if you look at our polling, and we've polled massively on this, other recent polling, the Hansard Society, we are possibly moving to a situation in the United Kingdom generally where the public always thought quite ill of individual MPs, right? But believed in the institution. It was worth the sum of its. It was more than the sum of its parts, right? So you know, so right. Of course, there's some Scott, but it's more than the sum of its parts. Now, for a variety of reasons, one was the way in which the expenses scandal made it harder to argue it's just a few bad eggs, you know, or a few rotten apples. For a variety of reasons, we're actually at a point where some of the polling would suggest we're moving beyond the kind of an expanded outward cynicism about members of Parliament because of the expenses crisis into actually a cynicism about Parliament as an institution. And I think that therefore creates a special problem that you have to bear in mind. Always have common sense. Like, you know, in 1944 when the British people were polled, now, whatever your view of British history is, in 1944, they were on the verge of, they held back Hitler for 4 years. You know, political leadership was on the verge of invading France, you know, and winning back the continent, pushing Hitler out, you know, and so on. You know, you could say it's a heroic moment in British history. A third of the British people polled thought then MPs were just out for themselves. Only a third thought the government knew what it was doing. So just bear that in mind, that, you know, even at a moment where, like, everybody, whatever their kind of point of view, would say, well, they weren't doing badly then, you know, people look back on with a certain patriotic. At the time, a large chunk of British public is still feathering their own nests. So bear in mind, it's all, you know, you go back to your point, it's not that easy to win. I bear in mind you have to have that degree of common sense about it, and the common sense, I mean, you know, my appointment documents endure me to hold. It basically says, don't break your back on trying to change these figures. They're not going to change very much. Just continue to do what you think is the right thing. Continue to advocate for Parliament the type of changes which are the right thing. Don't expect the public to say, let's say, for example, in the next Parliament there is more attention given to ethics awareness among MPs. Don't expect, and the CSPL has played a role in that argument, don't expect the public to say, well, that's great now, and so on. Just do it. That's the way. So that's the approach I've got. I'm just simply saying to you, it's a little bit. I'm on the side where I get nervous when I see figures now coming through that it's not just the individual members, but the institution. It's the all-enveloping nature of this crisis, of these crises of public standards in recent years, which are developing a new kind of thing, and so people move from BBC is suffering. Suddenly, it's not just Parliament. Suddenly, it's not just. A couple of people and some mistakes. It becomes, what were you doing, Jimmy Savile, whatever, and it's not just Parliament alone. It's something that's happening in these all-enveloping nature of these crises and the broad institutional contamination. And I get your point. I'm just saying that in my position, you can't afford to feel comfortable about that. You can't afford to say, oh, well, people are always a bit grumpy, and something else is happening here, which is a bit more worrying than that.
This is my fault. I brought in the perceptions thing instead of sticking to your code. If I can just have one question before I go to Fra. You'd mentioned in response to Mr. Boylan about how you felt it was appropriate that every 3 months or during a regular period, details of meetings with lobbyists. In terms of a lobbyist, what is your definition of a lobbyist? Is it somebody who is a paid advocate, or could somebody who is from your local community who is lobbying for a facility, is that a lobbyist? And would there not be difficulties then around data protection?
I think it's up to your assembly to define those rules. There's another complexity. Is it an intellectually defined interest, a think tank? Is that a lobbyist? In London, the current position is not, as I understand it. But you need to actually yourself make a decision as to what you think is a lobby. It has to be said that I suspect that as a problem in the form it exists in London, and I'm trying to indicate, I suspect it's not the same level of a problem here.
Okay.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah, Anna, if you, I don't know.
I mean, that's really very interesting about trying to balance. You said, when we meet one lobby group, we should balance our views and meet with maybe kind of the opposite argument. It's just going to be quite difficult. I understand what you're saying. For example, we have a lot of all-party group on single issues. A number of maybe, say, on different mental health issues, dementia versus something else. So if we have, say, a group or an APG on dementia, should we
That's
then...
all. I think common sense applies. Look, I'm one of the all-party groups. I completely get what you're at there, and I should clarify it a bit more. The certain areas there clearly is a reasonable public debate between two different people who are lobbying in different causes. I mean, let's take something it's on. I don't think people do lobby on in this way, but HS2. But there are arguments, reasonably acceptable public arguments on one side or the other about a railway line. But I mean, obviously in other areas, one's an example where you have APGs, and all that you deal with, the people you're concerned about. I'm heavily involved in less so now, but still involved, as supporter of the all-party group on human trafficking. Now, we meet with all kinds of groups in the who are concerned about human trafficking and so on. What we have not yet met with is the Human Traffickers Association. They have not come in to explain to us that human trafficking is actually not such a bad thing after all. They're increasing people's economic opportunities.
There's such a group
There's a certain price to pay for it. We haven't seen them. So I quite agree that it would be ludicrous to... That's your point, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's your point, yeah.
Fra, you've been very patient. So.
Some of them with set questions, or like the last two speakers, the sites. But they get back to the point and around lobbyists. And just to give you an example, that most of us are contacted by little builders or little thing who have a thing, and you go and represent them. Okay, if residents have an objection, you go and meet them. So, but if there's no thing, you're going and you're lobbying on their behalf for development that may be beneficial to.
Yeah, that's the lifestyle of democracy.
Yeah, but how do you distinguish between that? See, to give you an example, a number of years ago at Belfast City Council, when the whole thing around waste management was changing, and it was going out the public tender. It was a huge tender. There were actually councillors refused to go into the room in case they were heavily lobbied and they made a decision that may end up in court. Now, and some of us were at the rough end of lobbyists then. Obviously, say no, you report it and things like that there. But what's the difference? Was there lobbying for a contract? And a local builder will be lobbying also for something that will be financially beneficial to them.
Well, first of all, in terms of residents' association, one of the things you mentioned there is just a lifelong democracy. That's what it is. I mean, I did say earlier on that the whole point of our document is to accept that lobbying is a legitimate point of democracy. And the way out in difficult cases is transparency. In a way out in situations where and you should have, and we now do have, at least as partly as a result of our advocacy in at least one of the houses of Parliament, a way out where it's now for members of the House that I'm in, they can make clear what their dealings have been, and that has to be transparency, timeless sunlight has to be the way out, and the House should make it easier for you so to do. I mean, that's it's simple as that. But lobbying is not an illegitimate activity, and people, residents, for example, residents groups have legitimate concerns, which everybody sitting around this table, in different shape, I'm prepared to say, has had to respond to in some sort of time or another. That's not the issue. Is obviously, and this is why, in terms of significant gifts and so on, again, the sort of things that we're talking about. The issue is that what the public is concerned about here is the undue weight of money behind the scenes. And you should, and the House's rules should allow you to defend yourself, to allow you to meet lobbyists, and to make it clear that you have not been influenced by the undue weight of money behind the scenes. That's the only thing the public is really concerned about. I'm quite rightly concerned about.
Well, to see in terms of that, why do you think that gifts from professional lobbyists should be treated differently? And given the array of organisations and individuals who might make representations to members, how do you define a professional lobbyist?
Well, that I think is a very... I happen to think that for here, when there are relatively few... Let me put it like this. I won't talk about why we thought that in London, because... but... the more I reflect about it here, and even this discussion we're having this afternoon, the tone of it, professional lobbyists are not really that cannot be. I don't know. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I don't think that's a significant part of your lives. So I think there's a problem there. In other words, it's not a piece of wordage that I would stand over particularly as being particularly helpful to you.
Will we do have a session with some of the lobbyists next time round? So it'd be
And it goes back, because it was interesting at the start of your presentation. We were talking about the attitudes in different countries, and you came down to the Dutch and the British thing, and about the way the Dutch thought about their...
Yeah.
But do you not also agree that in many ways when I meant to ask you was, what is the attitude of the press in Holland?
Well, you see, that's everybody... When we had our seminar, which you can... it's on the website, on that our Eurobarometer document is like a survey of trust in different European countries, and it's on our website. You will see there, just as you're saying, Fra, that a number of people, and I mean some very, very serious people, not angry members of Parliament, but people who academically studied it for a long time, not people who are judicious and not in the first firing line of this, said, well, the reason for the difference is the press. The reason for that's the reason for the difference between the Dutch and the Dutch press doesn't major on stories of corruption and so on, and that I mean, I have a problem with now. So a lot of people whom I really respect, and you can see it that are on tape, get up and make that point 3 or 4 times in the discussion, which is implicit behind your question. But as far as I'm concerned, I understand why they did make that point, But in, yeah, and actually Ireland is exactly the same in this particular respect. We have a long press tradition going back to the 18th century of contempt may not being impressed by the people who rule you, right? And there's a constant blast upwards that they shouldn't be getting above themselves, and that's one of the great things about British life, that there is no, that they think they are wandering around, in the House of Westminster laying down the law. We're going to let them know that they're human just like the rest of us, and this or that is wrong. And that has been the culture since the 18th century, and it's the culture in this island too, and it's not going to change. But there is no question that the British press is orientated towards these and the aspects of, when you talk about transparency, now all our MPs, their expenses, everything is laid out there. The only problems that we have, according to IPSA, there's some people who find that the technology of reporting some things, and I totally sympathise with them. People make technical mistakes in reporting, but basically it's all out there. Press stories run all the time, and do you know about your Member of Parliament, this, that or the other? Something they have put down, and there's been no digging, behind the scenes. This person has said, and has obviously felt that for some reason that trip was completely valid for my work or whatever. No question, they put it down and they've declared it. And the press, no, I see stories which they never mention. All I did was switch on my computer last night, and I saw this, and that's the kind of thing which there is a problem. Is what you're getting at. I'm just reluctant to speak against what I see as a great British and Irish tradition of disdain for people in power. And that's why. So I'm not quite going to go down the road of all of the very distinguished people at our seminar. I said, look at the difference between Holland and Britain. Look at the difference between the Dutch press and the British press. That's the answer. That's why there's such a gap between actual experience of corruption in Britain and belief it's there. And the Dutch press is a more sedate press. Not saying it's not a democratic press, it's just more sedate than the British press. But do we really want a sedate press? Do we?
Probably asking the wrong people. Okay, bro. Anna had indicated she wanted to communicate if anybody else is on.
Just very quickly. In America, they are very strict about lobbyists. They all have to be registered, and also there's very strict criteria about hospitality, about gifts. Should we go down that road?
Well, first of all, perhaps I'm over-influenced, Anna, but I've just come back from Washington where my son was working in the last year, and I did actually, because I was there and because of the job I have, I did read quite a lot about the situation currently in Washington, and the conventional way, particularly I'm thinking of the work of Leibovich, is that actually the Obama regime's announced crackdown on lobbying has actually had virtually no impact at all, and lobbyists are still as well rewarded in Washington and its influence and close to power as and some of the things that are described in Leibovich's book, for example, are things that could not happen in London. So I'm not convinced that I know that this presidency was announced as the presidency would really crack down on lobbyists. I'm not sure that anybody actually thinks that lobbyists are any weaker in Washington today than they were 6 years ago. And some of the routes by which people, it's actually well worth reading, because some of the routes by which people gain influence with those close to, but when you're dealing with very large sums of money, the ability by indirect means, by, for example, supporting charities, not by nobody going to you and saying, here you are, here's a piece of legislation coming up in the Assembly, here's £10,000, but by supporting charities which senior people are known to be keen supporters of. The routes by which lobbyists actually intervene and then gain access to those people. And it's a massively complex, and this is not a £50 cheque to a charity, this will be millions and millions of dollars going to a charity that X person is interested in. So I don't think whatever's been said or whatever, there are registers and all that. I think that the reality is that lobbying is as live and K Street is live in Washington as it was 6 years ago. And that seems to be, a conventional wisdom on all sides, somewhat rightly accepted by all sides in Washington.
I think looking at the figures of spending on lobbying, I think now is more or less the same, if not more, than 6 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, nobody else has indicated any questions. So, Lord Blue, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And my apologies again about Ruth. It would all have been so much better if she'd been here. But there'll be a chance, I hope, for you to, for us to meet again, and for you to meet Ruth Thompson, who does head up the office, and who did an awful lot of the work on the lobbying document in particular. I'm very grateful for the opportunity, and thank you all for this afternoon's session. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, members, we'll move on then to agenda item 6. Again, review of the Code of Conduct. A number of submissions have been received. You'll find those at page 66 of your pack. I think Paul's going to briefly talk us through that.
Yes, Chair. Just as of today, we've received 17 responses to the consultation. Obviously, we've got one from the Committee on Standards in Public Life, which we've just discussed. Already discussed the submission from the Ombudsman and from Dr. Tom Walker from Queen's. In addition to those, we've received responses from the House of Commons Standards Committee and Commissioner, from the Welsh Commissioner, and of course from our own Commissioner. We received responses as well from the Speaker, the Electoral Commission, the Equality Commission, the Attorney General, ILGA, the Ulster Unionist Party, the Northern Ireland Government Affairs Group, SIPFA, and from one member of the public. So all of these submissions, we've got them here for you. They're in hard copy inquiry folders, which we'll provide to you. We've also summarised each of the points as raised by each respondent, broken down by the matters identified in our issues paper, and that's included in the meeting pack that you have today from page 72. And you'll see from looking at that, in most areas we've a wide range of comments to consider. There are certain matters, however, in the issues paper on which none of the respondents have actually provided comments. What's not included yet is a response from the Assembly Commission. We had written to them directly on some specific points, and it will be important for us to get their views, but I understand that a response from them will be forthcoming. Having reviewed the submissions, then we've arranged for the Equality Commission and the Northern Ireland Government Affairs Group to come and give evidence to the committee next week, and I think it's likely, once we've had an opportunity to consider the Commission's response, that we'll need to hear evidence from them as well. We may also need to hear from the Electoral Commission. We've got their initial submission, and they've told us that they would welcome the opportunity to explore with the committee the prospect of aligning the Assembly's reporting requirements with those in the Political Parties Elections and Referendums Act 2000 to bring about the end of dual reporting. And I think that's very encouraging, something that the committee had hoped we would hear. But the Assembly needs to agree its own categories of members' interests in advance of any decision to introduce a single point of reporting. So if the committee is content, I would write back on its behalf to the Electoral Commission just to establish exactly what it is that that the Assembly would need to do in order to align those before we start looking at how we'd go about bringing back a single or introducing a single reporting mechanism. And if, having received that further information, the committee felt it needed to hear evidence from the Electoral Commission, well, then we could always ask them at that stage.
Okay. Anna.
Chair, thank you, Chair. You said in your paper, I'm trying to find the page, that Community Relations Council has not responded, and you're hoping they may respond.
Yeah,
Will you accept their submission late?
Well, I mean, with deadlines like this, it's not like it's job applications or anything like that where someone's gaining some sort of advantage. Anybody that writes to the committee, I'll always put whatever they write to us in front of the committee. So ideally, we would have liked responses in before now, but if somebody writes to the committee after that date, I'd be putting it in front of you, and you can take those points into consideration.
Do we know why they missed the deadline?
No, not aware.
Okay.
Great. Any other questions, comments? Enough. Okay, members, the committee obviously visited the Scottish Parliament 1st of May. If you look at 97, page 97 of your packs, there's a summary of the key issues that were discussed during that. Obviously, for those of us who were there, we should already know that. For those who weren't, hopefully that's a helpful summary.
Nice pictures.
Yeah,
Chair.
nice pictures. Good. Any questions? Happy enough? Okay, we'll move on. Okay, if I can ask Commissioner to leave the room briefly.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29.